Greetings and welcome to the Residence of Evil. Beggy here. I hope you don't mind this certain someone walking beside us. We have something special for you tonight. Just recently, the official announcement trailer for Resident Evil 4 Remake was released. Now, if you're a fan of the original game, you probably recognized a number of iconic characters and environments from this trailer. But whether these images are familiar to you or not, the original game has a wealth of obscured lore that we'd like to share with veterans and newcomers alike, obscured elements that may also return in the remake. So if you're new to RE4, or even Resident Evil as a whole, you've come to the right place. As we approach the remake's release in March, we'll be releasing several deep dives on RE4's lesser understood lore, on creatures, characters, and concepts that aren't fully explained in-game. We'll then speculate on how these elements might be reimagined in the remake. Tonight, we'll be starting off with a bioweapon that revolutionized enemy designs in Resident Evil, as well as this enigmatic figure who devised it, a man named Osmond Sadler. His depiction in the new trailer conveys his dark intentions quite clearly. Even from the very short cut of his first appearance in the trailer, we can just barely tell that his staff is eerily animated, quite like it was in the original. Considering this, his hooded cloak, and his foreboding voice, his original portrayal has been preserved quite well, albeit more sinister than ever before. His face is almost entirely obscured by his hood, with his eyes and nose just barely protruding from the nebulous shadow that conceals his face. From what we can gather, his role in the remake is likely reflective of his role in the original, meaning that his origin story will likely carry over as well, in some form or another. We also see a cluster of tendrils emerging from his hand. This is one manifestation of a living parasite called Las Plagas, which attaches itself to one's nervous system and imposes its influence on the host. This is the chief bioweapon of Resident Evil 4, quite like the zombie-spawning T-virus is the dominant bioweapon of the first three titles. Both bioweapons amplify aggression in the hosts and strengthen their bodies, but unlike the T-virus, Las Plagas allows its hosts to retain their intelligence and motor functions. If we refer back to the original RE4, 3 species of Las Plagas were devised by Sadler. The first is the recessive plaga, which forces the host to obey those infected by the dominant species. Now, the dominant plaga, or second species, does not assert any influence over the host's mind, and instead allows the host to issue commands to those with the recessive species, and even to force them to mutate at will. You can think of recessive plaga hosts as puppets and the dominant plaga hosts as puppeteers. To ensure that power didn't end up in the wrong hands, Sadler only allowed 3 figures to harness the dominant plaga: himself, Ramon Salazar, and Vitores Mendez. These are the 3 primary antagonists of Resident Evil 4. But how exactly did they devise these 3 species, or even get their hands on the original plagas to begin with? All of the answers lie within Sadler's origin story, the Resident Evil 4 prequel book, also known as Biohazard 4 Incubate. While Sadler's biological puppeteering may be his most apparent strength, it's his cunning that earned him the villagers' veneration in the first place, and this book tells the story of his manipulation. Before we dive into it, we need to establish the history of the ganados. Although the term is most commonly used to refer to Sadler's puppets during the events of RE4, the term more accurately describes an indigenous society of Spain in close proximity to RE4's village. As we can tell from the murals on the island's caves, they performed gruesome pagan rituals for an indeterminate number of years, until a conqueror, by the surname Salazar, led a crusade to vanquish the pagan practitioners from the region and establish Catholic churches instead, hence the orthodox design of the church in RE4. So, if we reconcile this fictional crusader, Salazar, with the historical backdrop of the era, his victory over the ganados likely occurred sometime during the Reconquista, during which Christian kingdoms would fight to conquer various Jewish, Muslim, and pagan groups across the Iberian Peninsula, the same region that would become modern-day Spain and Portugal. Knowing this, the ganados can be considered one of the pagan societies eradicated during the Crusades, here by a fictional ruler, Salazar, who then discovered that they were plagas in the caves they inhabited. The bodily dismemberment depicted in these murals was ostensibly done to implant Las Plagas into the ganados' bodies. This type of ritual may be more pronounced in the remake, as implied by the stone emblem of 4 hands with blood flowing over it. Beyond any direct ties it may have with the ganados and its emblems, its iconography is also extremely similar to that of folk horror films like Midsommar. Given the game's similarities with The Wicker Man and the pagan practices alluded to in its prequel novel, it'd be a treat to see the remake include more classical pagan elements. Anyway, let's get back to Salazar. To seal off the Plagas from his people and ensure their safety, he built a castle atop the caves, which explains the desiccated remains of the Plagas in the castle's underground ruins. It's also interesting to note that while the Plaga population had existed in Spain for centuries before Salazar's arrival, Las Plagas is strongly evidenced to have actually originated in West Africa. The murals on the walls of the Nidapaya kingdom, as uncovered in Resident Evil 5, contain desiccated remains of Las Plagas. If this is true, then Las Plagas actually originated from the same place as the progenitor virus, which is essentially the mother of nearly every virus in the Resident Evil franchise. And also like the progenitor virus, Las Plagas has very little application in its innate, undeveloped form. So while Marcus and Spencer tried enhancing the progenitor virus to gain superhuman abilities and rule above all else, just as the ancient African tribes did, one man would rise to the challenge of biologically enhancing Las Plagas to ascend and rule in a similar manner. This man's name is Osmond Sadler. We now know the beginning and the end of Sadler's vision, to command his villagers as his puppets. The very word ganados roughly translates to livestock, which, in Sadler's mind, is precisely what his puppets represent: cattle. We already know he succeeded in his aims by creating the dominant and recessive Plaga. So, what happened in the middle? Or, more precisely, how would Osmond Sadler gain access to Las Plagas after their remains were sealed underground by Salazar, and how would Sadler convince the villagers to ingest them thereafter? Let's finally dive into the prequel novel to fill in the gaps. This novel is told through a series of notes left behind by a villager named Rodrigo. His notes depict the peaceful lives of the villagers before Leon arrives to investigate. While it begins with Rodrigo's accounts of the traditional farm work done by the villagers, chapters 5 and 6 are when the novel first hints to us that revolution is in the air. This is when the Castellans, or generational rulers, are first mentioned. At this point, the village community is now governed by Salazar's lineage, who rule from the castle overlooking the village. We learn that Salazar's victory over the pagan ganados ushered in a period of peace that lasted 7 generations. But in this 8th generation, a new ruler has risen to the throne, Ramon Salazar, who is implied to have withdrawn his protections for the people, somehow. We also learn that Rodrigo's friend has been excavating the castle's ruins, which again, have been sealed away for generations to prevent the Plagas from escaping. Ramon's rule and the excavation of the castle's ruins are indeed related, as only he could allow access to them. Next, let's take a look at chapters 8 and 9, both of which end by mentioning the village chief, Lord Mendez. His full name is Vitores Mendez, and unlike Ramon Salazar, this is another villain depicted in the new trailer. His depiction is also similar to that of the original RE4, with the most notable change being his new top hat. Anyway, he asks the villagers to attend church on the next Sunday, and it is here in the church, in chapter 10, that we finally come across Osmond Sadler for the first time. Through his sermon, he teaches the villagers how to cleanse their souls and purify their sinful blood. It's interesting to note that Sadler is respected and revered by Chief Mendez himself, which certainly helps to garner trust in the villagers. Rodrigo also recognizes that Sadler is a prophet of Los Illuminados, which he simply calls a religious organization here. By now, Rodrigo, and most other villagers, view Sadler as a genuine altruist and buy into the teachings of Los Illuminados. The religious fanaticism slowly becomes more and more tangible through Rodrigo's writing. Soon after, one of his friends undergoes a sudden transformation from calm to violent. Given that the same friend worked on excavating the ruins, he must have inhaled spores from the desiccated Plagas. His violent turn is characteristic of the parasite binding with one's body, as seen with Leon's brief moment of hostility towards Ada before he regained his consciousness. But sadly, Rodrigo sees his friend's violent behavior as a result of failing to attend Sadler's sermons. This is a pattern that repeats itself from this point forth, a pattern of Rodrigo's blindness to Sadler's vile deception. By this point, it's clear that Ramon Salazar obliged Sadler in his quest to unearth and study Las Plagas from the ruins. The next part of the story is when Sadler unleashes his curse upon the villagers. Yes, he lines them up and claims to purify their unclean bloodlines by offering them the sacred blood, which of course is how he administers the recessive plagas. Soon after, every one of the villagers ingests the sacred blood, and it kills every one of the children. And even as the adults descend into madness, not once do they consider the sacred blood to be Sadler's ploy. His cunning and their faith in him are what caused this calamity. The villagers receive a message from Chief Mendez. Lord Sadler's life may be in danger. If someone starts snooping around here, kill them. Kill any intruders on sight. Thus, chaos ensues, and Resident Evil 4 begins. I hope you learned something from this. If you want a more in-depth analysis of the villagers' lives during the prequel novel, I recommend viewing this analysis as well, as it examines the prequel book's pagan and folk horror elements much more closely. Before we say goodbye, the Duke would like a word with you. He's going to tell you a little about our sponsor, G Fuel.
Do you have need of anything for the road ahead? The Residence of Evil has expanded its services. Perhaps you're in need of a little pick-me-up. I recommend the G Fuel. You can even get a fair discount if you use the code ROE upon purchase. And as always, we thank you for your patronage, stranger.
We'll see you again soon, I'm sure. Until then, subscribe, or Chief Mendez will start knocking at your door.